On July 23, 2011, the world woke up to a headline that looked impossible. Amy Winehouse had been found dead in her home in Camden, North London. She was only 27. Outside, the street filled with cameras, police, flowers, and the stunned silence that only comes when a public tragedy feels too cruel to be real. For years, Amy had seemed to live at the edge of collapse, but death still arrived like a punch to the chest. It was not just that she was famous. It was that her voice had felt too alive, too sharp, too wounded to disappear this soon. In a city built on noise, Amy's death created a strange kind of quiet, and almost instantly, the world began repeating the same sentence in disbelief. Amy Winehouse is gone. What made the shock even heavier was that Amy had never felt like a distant celebrity. She felt exposed. Her songs did not hide behind glamour or polish. They bled. She sang about heartbreak, addiction, shame, desire, and self-destruction with a kind of honesty that made listeners uncomfortable because it sounded real. By the time Back to Black turned her into a global icon, Amy was no longer just a singer from London. She had become a symbol of raw talent, of old soul trapped inside a young body, of brilliance that seemed to burn too close to the skin. The public loved her, judged her, laughed at her, worried about her, and watched her fall in almost real time. So when the news broke, it did not feel like the death of a star alone. It felt like the end of a warning nobody knew how to stop. But the story of Amy Winehouse is not only the story of how she died. It is the story of how a voice powerful enough to stop the world could belong to someone so fragile behind the spotlight. How does a woman who could turn pain into music become consumed by that same pain? How does someone the whole world could hear become unreachable in the moments that mattered most? The tragedy of Amy was never just in the final headline. It was in the long, visible unraveling that came before it, and in the haunting feeling that everyone saw the fall coming, yet nobody could truly catch her. To understand why her death felt so devastating, we have to go back to the girl from North London before the fame, before the chaos, and before the world learned her pain by heart. Before the headlines, before the collapse, before the beehive hair and the black eyeliner became part of pop culture history, Amy Winehouse was just a girl growing up in North London. She was born on September 14, 1983, into a Jewish family with music already floating through the house. Jazz was not some distant art form to her. It lived in the background of family life, in old records, in familiar voices, in the atmosphere around the dinner table. Even as a child, Amy did not seem built for softness or obedience. She was sharp, funny, restless, and already carried that strange mix of vulnerability and defiance that would define her later. There was something in her presence that felt older than her age, as if she understood emotion before she had the language to explain it. Long before fame arrived, Amy was already absorbing the sounds and wounds that would eventually pour out of her music. As she grew older, that difference became harder to ignore. Amy did not look or behave like someone trying to fit neatly into a system. At school, she could be rebellious, impulsive, and impossible to smooth into shape. But what made her stand out was not just attitude, it was the voice. There are singers who learn technique, and then there are singers who sound like life has already happened to them. Amy belonged to the second kind. Even when she was young, her tone carried an unusual weight, smoky, bruised, intimate, and direct. She was drawn to artists who sang with truth instead of perfection, and that instinct would become the core of her artistry. She did not want to sound polished. She wanted to sound real. In a culture that often rewards performance over honesty, Amy was already moving in the opposite direction. She was becoming someone who would rather expose herself in a song than protect her image in public. That is what made the early Amy so compelling and so dangerous to the world she would later enter. Her gift was never just vocal power, it was emotional nakedness. She seemed born with the ability to turn private feeling into public confession, and that kind of talent rarely comes without a price. The same sensitivity that made her music extraordinary also made her more fragile than people understood. Underneath the wit and swagger, there was a young woman who felt things deeply, reacted intensely, and seemed to have no interest in pretending otherwise. North London gave her the accent, the humor, the attitude, and the cultural texture that would stay in her forever. But it also shaped a girl who was already learning to protect pain with irony and loneliness with performance. Before Amy Winehouse became a global icon, she was already becoming the person who could make the whole world stop and listen. The question was never whether people would notice her. The question was what that attention would eventually cost. The world did not fall in love with Amy Winehouse all at once. First came curiosity, then came recognition, then came obsession. Her debut album, Frank, introduced a voice that sounded completely out of step with its time, in the best possible way. While much of pop music chased gloss and control, Amy sounded loose, intelligent, wounded, and brutally human. Critics noticed the writing, the phrasing, the effortless way she could slide from sarcasm into sadness without warning. But Frank was only the beginning. The real explosion came with Back to Black. That record did not simply make Amy famous, it turned her into something rarer, an artist who felt instantly unforgettable. The songs were steeped in heartbreak, shame, desire, self-sabotage, and emotional hunger. Yet they were delivered with the elegance of old soul and the sting of someone confessing in real time. When listeners heard Rehab, You Know I'm No Good, and Back to Black, they were not just hearing catchy songs, they were hearing a woman transform private damage into public art. Amy did not sing as if she were performing pain. She sang as if she had already survived it, even while still living inside it. That is why her rise felt so magnetic. Amy was not built like a traditional pop star, and that only made the world watch her harder. She did not look polished, safe, or manufactured. She looked unmistakable. The towering beehive, the thick black eyeliner, the tattoos, the tiny dresses, the old-school glamour colliding with modern collapse. She became iconic because she looked like nobody else. But the image alone would have meant nothing without the voice. And the voice was extraordinary. It was deep but agile, bruised but playful, seductive but unsentimental. It carried the ghost of jazz clubs, Motown heartache, and late-night confession, yet it belonged unmistakably to a young woman from North London. Amy could make a lyric sound like a joke, a threat, a wound, and a confession all within the same verse. That rare emotional precision is what pushed her beyond celebrity into cultural myth. She was not only admired, she was studied, imitated, quoted, and watched. As Back to Black conquered country after country, Amy became one of the defining voices of her generation. Awards followed, the press followed, America followed. The Grammys turned her into a global event. Suddenly, the girl who once seemed too unusual for the mainstream had become one of the most recognizable women on earth. And yet, even at the height of her success, there was always something unsettling about the way the world loved her. People were drawn not only to her talent, but to the visible fractures inside it. Because while the rise looked glamorous from a distance, the deeper truth was more complicated. Amy's greatness came from the very parts of herself that offered the least protection. She wrote too honestly, felt too intensely, and revealed too much for fame to ever sit safely on her shoulders. The world embraced her because she was raw. But rawness is a dangerous thing when multiplied by cameras, money, pressure, and constant public hunger. As her fame grew, Amy stopped belonging only to herself. She became an image, a spectacle, a headline, a fascination. Crowds loved the music, magazines loved the chaos, and the machine around celebrity began feeding on both. That was the contradiction at the center of Amy Winehouse. The more successful she became, the less room there seemed to be for the private woman beneath the persona. Audiences saw confidence, wit, style, and genius. But underneath that surface was someone increasingly cornered by exposure, expectation, and the exhausting demand to keep turning real pain into something the world could consume. Back to Black made Amy immortal in music. It also trapped her in a role the public did not know how to separate from her suffering. She was no longer just a singer with astonishing gifts. She had become a symbol of heartbreak, danger, excess, authenticity, and self-destruction, all at once. And once the world fell in love with Amy Winehouse, it did not simply want her songs. It wanted access to her unraveling, too. Fame did not arrive in Amy Winehouse's life as a reward. It arrived like pressure. The more successful she became, the more the world seemed to confuse her pain with entertainment. Cameras followed her through London streets. Tabloids turned her worst moments into front-page theater, and every sign of instability became something to sell. There was no room for a quiet breakdown. There was no privacy in humiliation. Amy was photographed exhausted, bruised, intoxicated, heartbroken, and visibly unwell, while the public consumed those images almost as quickly as it consumed her music. What made it darker was that her talent never disappeared. Even in decline, there were still moments when her voice cut through everything and reminded people that beneath the spectacle was one of the greatest singers of her generation. But the machine around fame does not know how to love someone gently. It knows how to watch, amplify, and profit. Amy was not just living under pressure. She was being publicly devoured by it. At the center of that unraveling was a private life that seemed to become increasingly chaotic and destructive. Her relationships, especially the most turbulent one, appeared to deepen the emotional instability already inside her. Love, for Amy, never looked simple or safe. It looked consuming. The heartbreak that gave Back to Black its emotional force was not just an artistic theme, it was something she appeared to live inside long after the songs were recorded. Addiction made everything worse. Alcohol and drugs did not create all her pain, but they magnified it, distorted it, and pushed it into more dangerous territory. The tragedy was that Amy's vulnerability was never hidden. It was visible in her body, in her performances, in interviews, in the way she sometimes looked like she was trying to hold herself together by instinct alone. Yet visibility is not the same thing as rescue. The whole world could see that she was struggling, but public awareness did not become protection. It became part of the storm. That is what makes this chapter of Amy's life so painful to revisit. It was not a sudden fall. It was a slow-motion collapse, happening in full view. Each canceled show, each erratic performance, each hollow-eyed appearance seemed to raise the same question. How much more can she survive like this? And still, there remained flashes of the woman people first fell in love with. Funny, sharp, musically brilliant, impossible to imitate. That contrast made everything more haunting. Amy was not disappearing because she had nothing left. She was disappearing while still visibly gifted, still young, still capable of astonishing people. That is why her story never felt like simple celebrity scandal. It felt like watching someone too sensitive for the brutality around her being worn down piece by piece. By the end, the question was no longer whether Amy Winehouse was in danger. The question was whether anyone, including Amy herself, could stop what had already been set in motion. In the final chapter of Amy Winehouse's life, everything felt suspended between hope and collapse. There were still people around her who believed she could recover, still moments that suggested she might find a way back from the chaos that had swallowed so much of her 20s. But recovery, especially for someone as fragile and exposed as Amy, was never going to be a straight line. By 2011, the damage was no longer hidden. Her body looked thinner, her energy more unstable, and her public appearances carried an unbearable tension, as if the world was watching not a comeback, but a struggle to remain standing. One of the most haunting details is that Amy made a final public appearance only days before she died, stepping on stage briefly in London to support her goddaughter, Diane Bromfield. It was not a grand return. It was a short, almost ghost-like moment. And looking back now, that image feels devastating. There she was, still present, still loved, still somehow within reach of life, yet already drifting toward the silence no one wanted to imagine. That is what makes the final days so painful. They did not look like the end in a dramatic, cinematic sense. They looked uncertain, fragile, unfinished, and perhaps that is why the ending hurt so much. It arrived not with resolution, but with interruption. Then came July 20th, 2011. Amy Winehouse was found dead at her home in Camden, North London. She was 27 years old. The details that followed would later confirm alcohol poisoning, but in the first hours, what spread faster than information was disbelief. The street outside her house filled with photographers, police, onlookers, and then flowers. So many flowers. Tributes began forming almost immediately, as if the public needed to build something visible out of grief before the truth had fully settled in. Around the world, the reaction was immediate because Amy's death did not feel like the loss of a celebrity in the ordinary sense. It felt like the loss of unfinished possibility. She had one of the most distinctive voices of her generation, and even after years of scandal and decline, people still held on to the idea that she might survive long enough to become something even greater. Instead, she became another young genius, frozen in time. The old pattern returned once more: talent, damage, fame, excess, death at 27. But reducing Amy to the 27 club alone misses the deeper tragedy. She was not memorable because she died young. She was memorable because she had already told the truth about pain more honestly than almost anyone else, and then became consumed by the very darkness her songs exposed. Her funeral, held just days later, was intimate compared to the size of the global mourning that surrounded it. Family and close friends gathered to say goodbye, while outside, the world continued grieving through headlines, flowers, candles, old performances, and songs replayed with new meaning. That contrast says everything about Amy Winehouse. In life, she was watched by millions. In death, she was returned to those who loved her most. And yet even after the funeral ended, Amy did not leave. Her legacy remained far larger than the tabloid myth that once tried to define her. She left behind music that still sounds uncomfortably alive, Songs that do not age because they are built from truths people never stop recognizing. Longing, shame, love, relapse, pride, loneliness, and the desperate wish to be understood. Amy's voice carried damage, but it also carried intelligence, humor, timing, and soul so deep it felt borrowed from another era. That is why she endures. Not as a cautionary headline, not as a tragic aesthetic, but as one of the rare artists who could make suffering sound elegant without ever making it false. Amy Winehouse died at 27, but the voice she left behind never learned how to disappear. It still enters a room the same way it always did, wounded, defiant, intimate, and impossible to ignore.